I never thought a small ceramic figure could turn my entire life upside down. To be honest, I wasn't the type to decorate my yard with quirky things. But one day, while shopping at a local flea market, I spotted a little garden gnome. He was chipped around the hat, his paint a bit faded, but he had this mischievous grin that made me laugh out loud. For a few bucks, I figured, why not? I brought him home and set him by the roses in my front yard. That gnome didn't seem like a big deal. In fact, I thought it added a touch of charm, maybe even personality, to an otherwise plain yard. But a week later, I found a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door. My heart sank immediately because I knew what it was. Another letter. From the HOA, I ripped it open and read, "Violation, unauthorized lawn decoration. You are hereby fined $100 for the placement of an unsanctioned ornament in your front yard. Remove it immediately to avoid additional fines." I actually laughed out loud. $100 for a gnome. I thought it was some kind of joke. I even checked twice to make sure it wasn't a prank by one of my neighbors. But no, the HOA was dead serious. Now, I'll admit our HOA has always been picky. They fined people for things like leaving trash bins visible for an extra hour, for planting flowers that weren't on the approved color palette, and even for having curtains that didn't match from the outside. But a garden gnome. That was a new level of absurd. I decided to play a long knot first. I brought the gnome inside, figuring it wasn't worth the headache. But the more I thought about it, the more it ate at me. Why should they get to decide what's on my lawn? Why should a tiny, harmless decoration cost me $100? That night, as I sat in my living room staring at the little gnome sitting on my coffee table, an idea struck me. If one gnome was enough to make them angry, what would 100 gnomes do? It started as a joke in my head. It's a little fantasy of getting back at them. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to do it for real. Why not? Why not turn my yard into the very thing they were trying to erase, a bold, unapologetic display of individuality? The next weekend, I drove around town, scouring thrift stores, yard sales, and even online listings. Everywhere I went, I picked up gnomes. Fat ones, tall ones, gnomes fishing, gnomes sleeping, gnomes riding turtles and holding lanterns. By the end of the month, I had a collection that was honestly kind of insane. And one quiet Saturday morning, I planted them all. Every single gnome found a home in my yard. Some were perched on the fence. Others nestled in flower beds. A few even lined the walkway to my porch like tiny soldiers guarding my house by the time I stepped back to look at my work. I couldn't stop laughing. It was ridiculous. It was bold. And it was exactly what I needed. The next day, the HOA president nearly choked on his morning coffee when he drove by. I saw his car slow to a crawl, then speed away. Later that afternoon, I got another letter. This time, it wasn't a $100 fine. It was a threat of legal action. But here's the funny part. While the HOA fumed, my neighbors started to love it. People walking their dogs would stop just to laugh at the gnome army. Cars slowed down to take pictures. Kids pointed excitedly at the fishing gnome by the mailbox or the one on a swing hanging from my tree, and within a week, word spread beyond the neighborhood. Someone posted a picture of my yard on social media, and suddenly my little rebellion was going viral. I had no idea that a single gnome would spark a movement that would turn my yard into a tourist attraction. The next day, I opened my mailbox, and there it was. Crisp white envelope stamped with the HOA's bold red logo. I already knew it wasn't going to be a love letter. I tore it open and read the words aloud. Violation notice. Unauthorized lawn ornament. Immediate removal required. Fine. $50. $50. For a single garden gnome. Now, I could have just paid the fine, removed the gnome, and gone back to living quietly like the HOA wanted. That would have been the easy option. But the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. My gnome wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't blocking sidewalks. It wasn't dangerous. It was just whimsical. And yet, somehow, this harmless little statue was enough to trigger the wrath of the HOA board. I sat there, staring at the notice, and something inside me shifted. I wasn't angry, at least, not at first. I was amused. Because if one garden gnome was against the rules, well, what would they do if I had to? Or 3? Or 10? That's when the idea sparked. Instead of taking the gnome away, I decided to give it some company. I went online, found a bulk lot of gnomes for sale, and ordered them. Brightly painted ones, old rustic ones, tall ones, squat ones. By the time I was done clicking, I had a cart filled with little ceramic rebels, an entire army of misfit gnomes. The delivery driver must have thought I was opening a bizarre theme park. Box after box arrived on my porch, and I couldn't stop grinning as I unwrapped each one. Every gnome seemed to have its own personality. Some were fishing, some were lounging, some were caught mid-dance. That night, under the cover of darkness, I lined them up across my yard, 10 gnomes. Side by side. The next morning, I sat on my porch with my coffee, waiting for the neighbors to notice. And oh, did they notice? One neighbor slowed her car to a crawl, rolled down her window, and squinted. Another stopped walking his dog just to point at my yard in disbelief. A few kids riding their bikes shouted, "Cool gnomes." But the best reaction came from the HOA president himself, Mr. Peterson, when he drove past on his way to work. His car slowed, stopped, and then reversed. He rolled down his window, his face turning bright red, and shouted across the street, "This is not funny." But oh, it was hilarious. Within an hour, another notice landed in my mailbox. This one wasn't $50, it was $500. Apparently, multiple unauthorized lawn ornaments were a serious offense. But by then, I wasn't backing down. No, this was war, and if they thought 10 gnomes was bad, they hadn't seen anything yet. I'll never forget the morning I woke up and saw a crowd of people standing outside my house, pointing at my yard, laughing, taking pictures, and recording videos on their phones. For a moment, my sleepy mind thought there was some kind of emergency, maybe a fire, maybe an accident. But no, they were all staring at my army of gnomes. It had started out as a joke, a petty response to the HOA's fine, but now it was quickly turning into something bigger. My yard wasn't just a lawn anymore, it was becoming a spectacle. Kids from the neighborhood dragged their parents over just to look. I overheard one little boy gasp, "Mom, this one has a fishing pole." And another say, "Look, a gnome." Astronaut. I had gone from being the man the HOA wanted to silence to the man people couldn't stop talking about. But with attention came consequences. That same afternoon, the HOA president, Margaret, marched up to my front door in her usual stiff blazer, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tightly they looked like they were sewn shut. She didn't knock. She banged. When I opened the door, she glared past me at the gnomes as though they were personally mocking her existence. "Mr. Thompson," she began, voice sharp as broken glass. This display is out of control." One gnome was against our community guidelines, and now you've cluttered your yard with an entire army of them. This is an egregious violation. I leaned casually against the doorframe, doing my best to look unbothered, even though my heart was pounding. "Funny, Margaret. I checked the guidelines. They say no lawn ornament exceeding 3 feet in height. None of mine are over 3 feet. In fact, the tallest one is about 2.5. You measured, remember?" Her face twitched. She hated that I had done my homework. Yes, but she sputtered, flipping through her clipboard papers like there was some hidden clause she could suddenly produce. "But the quantity. This is visual clutter. I couldn't resist grinning. Visual clutter isn't in the rules, Margaret. Her cheeks flushed red. This is a community, Mr. Thompson, not a circus sideshow. I glanced out at the crowd gathering on the sidewalk, phones raised, smiling, laughing. Some of them waved at me. A couple of teenagers even shouted, "We love the gnomes." Funny you should say that, I told her. Because the community seems to enjoy it. Her lips thinned into a razor line, and I could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. You'll regret this. The board will not tolerate mockery of our bylaws. Not from you, not from anyone. She spun on her heel and stormed away, heels clicking furiously against the pavement. The crowd chuckled. Someone whispered, "Looks like the gnomes won that round." But deep down, I knew Margaret wasn't done. The following week, things escalated. I started receiving letters, unluckily official-looking ones, stamped with the HOA's emblem, claiming that my gnome infestation was lowering property values. They demanded immediate removal. But here's the thing. My neighbors weren't complaining. In fact, many of them stopped by to say the gnomes brightened their day. Some even offered to donate their own gnomes to add to the collection. It wasn't just my rebellion anymore. It was becoming a neighborhood project. One neighbor, Carol, brought me a gnome dressed like Elvis Presley. Another dropped off a garden gnome holding a miniature HOA suck sign that I'm pretty sure he handcrafted himself. It became a chain reaction. Every few days, another gnome appeared on my lawn like magic. The HOA hated it. The people loved it. And then came the media. It started with a local news reporter who knocked on my door one Saturday morning. She introduced herself, microphone in hand, cameraman beside her. "We've been hearing about your unusual protest," she said, struggling not to laugh as she gestured toward the yard. "Do you mind if we do a story on it?" I hesitated. My instinct told me that more exposure meant more trouble. But another part of me knew this could be my chance to show the world just how ridiculous the HOA was being. So I agreed by the following evening. My face and my gnomes were on the 6 o'clock news. The headline read, "Man turns HOA fine into gnome army protest." I went viral. People online loved it. Memes popped up overnight. Gnome soldiers, gnome parades. Gnomes overthrowing the HOA. My lawn was dubbed the Gnome Sanctuary. Tourists started driving through just to take selfies with the gnomes. I had unwittingly created a tourist attraction, and while I laughed at first, I began to feel the weight of what I had started. The crowds grew bigger. Cars lined up on the street. My driveway was constantly blocked. My yard wasn't just mine anymore, it belonged to everyone. Night. I'd sit by my window and look at the gnomes illuminated by the glow of streetlights, wondering if I'd gone too far. What started as petty revenge was spiraling into something I couldn't fully control. But just as those doubts crept in, Margaret and the HOA gave me another reason to keep going. The board called a special meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but word spread fast. A friend who lived across from the HOA clubhouse told me that. Margaret's voice echoed through the walls as she shouted about me. "They want to file a lawsuit," he told me afterward. "They're saying your gnomes are a public nuisance." A lawsuit, I'll admit, that scared me. I wasn't exactly swimming in money. Now the thought of legal fees made my stomach churn. But before I could spiral too far into worry, something unexpected happened. The local business association reached out. They wanted to sponsor a gnome festival, food trucks, music, games all centered around my gnome yard. They even offered to cover legal costs if the HOA followed through with their threats. What had started as a petty feud had now snowballed into a full-fledged community movement. And I realized something important. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. This wasn't just my battle. It had become a symbol of standing up against controlling systems, against people like Margaret who believed they could micromanage everyone's lives, and that gave me the strength to keep going. Even when Margaret stood at the edge of my lawn, one night staring at the gnomes with eyes full of fury, whispering, "This isn't over." Even when the HOA slipped more threatening letters under my door. Even when the crowds grew so large that I could barely step outside without someone asking for a photo. Through it all, I knew one thing for sure. I'd rather be the man with 100 gnomes than the man who gave in to the HOA's bullying, because sometimes the silliest rebellions make the loudest statements, and mine was only just beginning. You'd think by now the HOA would have realized I wasn't backing down. I mean, after the 50 gnomes and then the slow but steady rise to over 80, you'd think they would have just cut their losses. Maybe, in a rational world, they would have even joined in, seen the humor, maybe even celebrated the uniqueness of the neighborhood. But no, the HOA doubled down. Hard it started small, as always. Letters slipped under my door. You are still in violation of the community standards. You are in breach of the landscaping aesthetics clause. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. I stopped even opening the envelopes. They were stacked in a neat little pile in my garage, rubber banded together like trophies. Each one was another small reminder that I wasn't just fighting for gnomes anymore. I was fighting for the right to enjoy my own home without some board of clipboard warriors breathing down my neck. But the HOA didn't just rely on paper threats this time. They began sending inspectors. That's right, inspectors, men in khakis and polo shirts with laminated badges clipped to their belts. They came on weekdays while I was at work, snapping photos, peeking over my fence, documenting my so-called violations. My neighbor Carol texted me one day while I was at the shop. "There in your yard, again, taking pictures of the gnomes." I clenched my teeth so hard I nearly cracked a molar. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was harassment. So what did I do? Well, if they wanted to play games, then fine. I'd play too. The very next weekend, I hosted what I called the Gnome Parade. I invited friends, coworkers, and even a few curious strangers from the Facebook group that had been following my saga. Everyone showed up, dressed in red pointy hats and fake white beards. We set up lawn chairs along the street, blasted polka music, and paraded more gnomes down the sidewalk in a ridiculous little procession. Children were laughing, neighbors were clapping, and yes, cars slowed down just to watch. My yard, already filled with over 90 gnomes, gained 10 more that day as gifts. Someone even brought a gnome riding a flamingo floaty. Another gifted me a solar-powered gnome DJ booth, complete with miniature speakers. It was hilarious. It was joyful. And it was utterly infuriating to the HOA that night. Another notice was taped to my door in all caps. "Public gatherings without permission are prohibited." I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch swing. Imagine a bunch of people in gnome hats drinking lemonade counted as a public gathering. But as the weeks dragged on, things started to shift. The HOA wasn't just threatening anymore. They were organizing. I overheard snippets from neighbors who were more sympathetic. Then they let on. Apparently, the board was holding emergency meetings about me. Some wanted to escalate legally, to sue me for property value damages. Others were lobbying the city to get involved. It was surreal. All this over gnomes. But here's the thing about attention. Once it starts snowballing, it doesn't stop. The local paper had already done a feature. Then a regional news station picked it up. And then the big one. A national morning show reached out, wanting to do a lighthearted segment about the man who turned his lawn into a gnome sanctuary. And oh boy, when that aired, things went from amusing to explosive. Suddenly, my quiet little cul-de-sac became a tourist stop. Cars would drive by slow. Kids would beg their parents to pull over. And people actually started leaving little trinkets and gnome figurines at my doorstep, like I was running some kind of shrine. One family drove 2 hours just to take selfies with the gnomes. They left me a thank you note tucked under the flower pot. Thank you for making our day magical. That one got me. Because yeah, I was fighting the HOA. But in that moment, I realized this was bigger than that. People were craving something whimsical, something silly in a world that often felt too heavy. And if my yard full of weird little statues gave them that, then so be it. Of course, the HOA didn't see it that way. Now they weren't just mad, they were humiliated. The president, Mr. Simmons, started patrolling the neighborhood himself. He'd walk past my yard daily, glaring at the gnomes like they personally insulted his mother. Once, I caught him muttering under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. And then, the petition happened. The HOA circulated a petition to have me removed from the neighborhood, not just fined, not just sued, literally kicked out. When I found out, I laughed. At first, but then I read the fine print. Apparently, if enough homeowners agreed, they could take collective action to enforce a forced buyout of my property. Basically, they wanted me gone. I won't lie, that one scared me. For the first time, I started to question if I had gone too far. Sure, I was stubborn, but was it worth losing my home? That night, sitting on my porch, I stared at the glowing solar gnomes scattered across the yard. Their little painted smiles seemed to mock me. Was I a hero, or just a fool with too much pride? But then Carol came over. She didn't knock. She just sat beside me and handed me a beer. You know, she said, you're not the only one sick of Simmons and his rules. Half this neighborhood's been too scared to stand up to him. But you did it, and now people have a reason to rally. She was right, and that's when the twist came. The petition backfired. Instead of people signing it, neighbors started crossing their names out, not because they loved the gnomes necessarily, but because they were tired of being bullied. The more the HOA pushed, the more the community pushed back. And when a TV crew came back for a follow-up, guess who stood beside me, arms crossed, refusing to be intimidated? Carol, and behind her, half the street. That night, we had a block party, not an illegal gathering, not a protest. Just neighbors laughing, music playing, kids running around with glow sticks, and yes, gnomes everywhere. It felt less like a battle and more like a victory parade. But Simmons wasn't done. The HOA had one last card to play, and they were about to lay it down in a way that would shock everyone. I remember waking up one morning to find an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. The envelope had the dreaded HOA letterhead stamped on it. I tore it open with a mix of curiosity and dread, and sure enough, there it was, a violation. Notice, apparently, I was being fined for unauthorized lawn ornaments. And what was the ornament in question? A single garden gnome. Just one. He wasn't even flashy or offensive, just a small, cheerful gnome holding a watering can nestled beside my rose bush. At first, I thought it had to be a joke. A gnome? Really? But no, the fine was very real, and the letter came with a stern warning that I had 7 days to remove the offending decoration or face escalating penalties. I sat on my porch staring at that little gnome, who seemed to grin at me in solidarity, as if he knew he'd just sparked the beginning of something bigger than either of us could imagine. I could have just removed him. That would have been the simple solution. But the pettiness of the HOA hit a nerve. Why did they care so much about one harmless gnome? Why did they think they had the right to dictate every little detail of how I enjoyed my own yard? When the idea struck me, if they thought one gnome was a problem, they hadn't seen anything yet. The very next weekend, I made a trip to every thrift store, yard sale, and garden shop I could find. I came home with a dozen more gnomes holding lanterns, some fishing, some riding little ceramic turtles. By the time I planted them all across my lawn, it looked like a miniature gnome village had popped up overnight. Neighbors walking by slowed down to gawk. Some smiled and laughed, others shook their heads, but everyone noticed, and I knew that was just the beginning. Sure enough, another HOA letter arrived. This one was dripping with indignation. They claimed my property now had excessive, unauthorized decor and that I was creating a nuisance for the neighborhood. The fine had doubled, but I wasn't backing down. If anything, the letter fueled me even more. I doubled my efforts. I ordered boxes of gnomes online. I drove 2 towns over to pick up rare ones from estate sales. A pirate gnome, a firefighter gnome, a gnome lounging in a hammock. Slowly, my yard transformed into something magical and absurd all at once. By the time I hit 50 gnomes, people were stopping to take pictures. Kids loved it. Families on evening walks lingered in front of my house. A local photographer even asked if he could do a gnome photo shoot for a quirky art project. Meanwhile, the HOA's fury escalated. They sent threats, called emergency meetings, and even tried to argue that my lawn was bringing down property values. But the thing was, my lawn wasn't messy. It was colorful, playful, and neatly maintained. There was no trash, no damage. Nothing they could really latch onto, except their irrational hatred of gnomes. The breaking point came when a local news station picked up the story. A reporter showed up at my door, microphone in hand, asking why I had filled my lawn with an army of ceramic guardians. I told them the truth. It started as a protest against an overreaching HOA, but it turned into a statement about individuality, community, and having a little fun in life. That interview aired on the evening news, and overnight, my house became a sensation. People drove from surrounding towns just to see the gnome yard. Cars slowed down, people took selfies, and small businesses even reached out asking if they could sponsor gnomes with their logos on them. The HOA lost its mind. They tried to issue bigger fines, but I fought them every step of the way. When they realized they couldn't actually stop me without looking ridiculous in front of the entire community, they shifted tactics. They begged me to tone it down. They argued that the traffic to my house was disruptive. But by then, it was too late. The gnomes had become a local landmark. At one point, I had over 100 gnomes scattered across my lawn, creating little scenes. A gnome tea party, a gnome construction crew, even a wedding between 2 gnomes, complete with a tiny arch and gnome guests. People loved it so much that the city eventually stepped in, not to stop me, but to officially recognize my lawn as a public point of interest. There were even discussions about adding it to the local tourism guide. The HOA had no choice but to back down completely. Ironically, the property values they claimed I was hurting, they went up. Real estate agents started boasting about how buyers loved the unique charm of the neighborhood. And some even advertised houses as being close to the famous gnome yard. As for me, I kept the gnomes, but I also built a little path through the yard so visitors could walk among them without stepping on my grass. It became a gathering place, a conversation starter, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest rebellions can turn into the biggest movements. All of this because the HOA decided one single gnome was too much. If they had just left me alone, my yard would still have just one smiling little gnome by the rose bush. But instead, they turned it into something bigger than any of us ever expected, a story that people still tell when they drive past my house, slowing down to wave at me and at the 100 gnomes who now call my lawn home. And as I sit on my porch each evening, sipping coffee and watching people stop to admire the gnomes, I can't help but smile. Because in the end, I didn't just win against the HOA, created something joyful for the whole community. So the next time someone tries to tell you that your joy, your creativity, or your individuality doesn't belong, remember my little army of gnomes. What started as one small act of defiance turned into something that brought laughter, unity, and even a touch of fame. Sometimes the best way to fight pettiness is with imagination. Sometimes the things meant to tear us down end up building us into something unforgettable.